Picture this. It's June 28, 1914, in Sarajevo. A car carrying Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary takes a wrong turn. A young nationalist, Gavrilo Princip, is standing right there, and he sees his chance. But what if that car had never made that wrong turn? What if the driver had stayed on the planned route? That one tiny change, that simple twist of fate, could have prevented the assassination that lit the fuse for World War I. If that war had never happened, the world we know today would be completely unrecognizable. So, let's explore that alternate timeline. What would a world without the Great War actually look like? First, let's look at the map. In 1914, the world was dominated by massive, sprawling empires. The British Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. Without World War I, these giants likely wouldn't have crumbled so quickly. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, a complex web of different ethnicities, was already facing internal pressures. Without the strain of a devastating war, it might have slowly evolved, perhaps into a federalized state. Something like a United States of Greater Austria, giving more autonomy to its diverse peoples. It might have survived for decades longer, a major power in the heart of Europe. Then there's the Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe. It was already in decline, but the war was the final blow. Without it, the empire could have continued its modernization reforms. The Middle East as we know it today, with borders drawn by Britain and France, simply wouldn't exist. There would be no Sykes-Picot Agreement. The political landscape from Turkey to Iraq would be fundamentally different. Perhaps we'd see a more gradual transition of power. Or maybe different internal conflicts would have reshaped the region on its own terms, without direct European intervention. And what about the Russian Empire? The war was a catastrophe for the Tsar. The immense casualties and food shortages on the home front led directly to the Russian Revolution in 1917 and the rise of the Bolsheviks. Without the war, would the revolution still have happened? It's possible, as discontent was already brewing. But it might have been a different kind of revolution, perhaps less violent, or it might have been avoided altogether through reforms. A Russia without Lenin and Stalin. That alone is a world-changing event. A constitutional monarchy or a different form of government might have emerged, keeping Russia on a completely different trajectory, and the entire Cold War might have been averted. Now, let's talk about technology and society. World War I was a brutal accelerator of technological change. It gave us tanks, fighter planes, chemical weapons, and massive advances in medicine to deal with the horrific injuries. Without the urgent need for these military innovations, technological progress would have been much slower, and probably more focused on civilian applications. Aviation would have developed, but more for mail delivery and passenger travel, not for dogfights in the sky. Maybe we wouldn't have had the jet age as quickly. Socially, the war was a major catalyst for change. Millions of women entered the workforce to replace the men who went to fight. This was a huge step towards women's suffrage and greater gender equality in many countries. Without the war, would the push for women's rights have been as powerful? It certainly would have continued, but the timeline might have been significantly delayed. The old social hierarchies and class structures of pre-war Europe might have persisted for much longer. And here's a big one. What about World War II? The Second World War is, in many ways, a direct sequel to the first. The harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I, crippled Germany and created deep resentment. This resentment was the fertile ground in which Nazism and Adolf Hitler rose to power. Without World War I, there is no Treaty of Versailles. Without that treaty, a figure like Hitler might have remained an unknown, failed artist. The political landscape of Germany would be completely different. The Weimar Republic would never have existed, and the deep economic and political instability that allowed extremist ideologies to flourish might have been avoided. So, no World War I could very well mean no Hitler, no Holocaust, and no World War II. Think about the tens of millions of lives saved. The entire course of the 20th century is altered. This also means no nuclear bomb, at least not in the 1940s. The Manhattan Project was a direct result of the fear that Nazi Germany would develop one first. Without that arms race, the nuclear age might have dawned much later, or in a completely different context. The United States' role in the world would also be vastly different. World War I marked America's emergence as a global superpower. It went from being a detonation to the world's leading creditor. Without the war, the US might have remained more isolationist for longer. The American century might never have happened, or it would have taken a very different form. European empires, particularly the British, would have likely maintained their global dominance for much longer, and the power dynamic of the world would be completely rebalanced. Of course, this alternate world isn't necessarily a utopia. It's not a world without conflict. The old empires were full of tensions. Nationalistic movements in the Balkans, in Ireland, and across Eastern Europe were already strong. Without the Great War, these conflicts might have erupted in other ways, perhaps a series of smaller, regional wars instead of one massive global catastrophe. The decline of the old empires was likely inevitable, war or no war. The process might just have been slower and perhaps less bloody, but it would have been messy. Colonial independence movements across Africa and Asia would still have fought for their freedom. The path to self-determination would still have been a struggle. But the sheer scale of the horror of World War I is what makes it a defining moment. It shattered an entire generation's belief in progress and order. It created a deep cultural and psychological trauma that echoed for decades. A world without that specific trauma would be more optimistic, perhaps more naive. Art, literature, and philosophy would be completely different. The modernist movement, born from the disillusionment of the war, might not have taken the same shape. So, what are we left with? A world where the great empires of Europe slowly reform or break apart over decades, not years. A world where the Middle East is drawn on different lines. A Russia that never becomes the Soviet Union. A Germany that never falls to Nazism. No World War II, no Holocaust, no Cold War. A world where the United States is a major power, but not the singular global hegemon it became. It's a world that is, in many ways, unrecognizable. That one wrong turn in Sarajevo truly was one of the most significant moments in human history. The world we live in, for better and for worse, was forged in the trenches of the First World War. Pondering a world without it shows just how fragile history is, and how a single moment can change everything. What do you think? What other major changes would we see in a world where World War I never happened? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching. And if you enjoyed this journey into alternate history, be sure to like and subscribe for more.